everyone, and welcome to Computerized Quilting on a Domestic Machine. This is session number 4. If you have questions for our presenter, please type them into the questions box, and we'll have a question answer session at the very end. We have 4 handouts available in the handout section, so please make you go over there and download those. They're all 4 handouts from all the sessions so far. If you're viewing on an Apple product, your screen might look a little different. You might either have to swipe left or right on your screen to either view the presenter or the presentation. The handouts are located in the More button, and then there is a question mark, which is where you input your questions. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, the best thing is to exit the webinar, close out your internet browser, and relaunch the webinar. If you miss any part of the presentation at any time, don't worry, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available on BERNINA.com along with the handouts and on YouTube in a few days, so you can rewatch it as many times as you like. So right now, I'd like to introduce Connie Fanders. She is the manager of BERNINA Embroidery Products. Hi, Connie.
Well, hello, Emily, and I'm glad to be back for webinar number 4. So let's go ahead and get started. You can share my screen, Emily. Okay, so like I said, we have made it to webinar number 4 on our Computerized Quilting with a Domestic Machine webinar series. And this afternoon, or in this webinar, we're going to talk about quilting possibilities, which means we are going to talk about choosing the best quilting techniques for your next project. We've talked about computerized quilting as another technique that you can use to quilt quilts. You can use it in combination with the stitch regulator, or for free motion quilting. You can use it in combination with straight line quilting and ruler work. And it really simulates the look of what you can get with long arm quilting and with automation. So what I'm going to do today is take you through the projects that I've been showing you through this series and work through them with you, work through the thought process, why the designs were chosen, which battings I used, threads, needles, and so forth. And so by knowing this background of how I thought through it, hopefully that will help you when you go to planning your next quilt projects as well. So let's begin with the X's and O's quilt. And this particular quilt was a 32 by 32 is the finished size. And when I started this project, I wanted the look and the feel to be, I wanted it a very stable quilt because I wanted to use it as a table topper. And I also wanted it to be very dimensional and for the designs to just pop. So to do that for embroidery designs, I chose one of Amanda's collections, which is written up here on the screen. And then for the thread, I did use a 50 weight cotton thread in the top and in the bobbin. And I did use an embroidery needle, and I did go up to a size 80 as opposed to a 75, which I normally use because I have 2 layers of the warm and white batting in there. And then in terms of securing stitches, because we talked quite a bit about securing stitches, I had them turned on at the beginning and at the end of this particular design. Now for the quilting techniques on this quilt, I did first of all straight line quilting, and I did that around the blocks, and I did this as my securing stitch and or as opposed to a basting stitch. So that secured all of the blocks in the quilt together as I then went to my machine, and then I did the computerized quilted blocks. And so I added the blocks to the quilt. And then my last step is with the free motion, I did the border of this quilt. So now as we talk through the process of this, my first step, of course, was to baste the quilt. As I said, I did the securing stitches with just a straight line quilting stitch and the dual feed, or you could use the walking foot if that's what you have with your machine. Then I hooped the fabric. And in hooping, I didn't need to worry about how I hooped it, if it was lined up with anything. I just had to make sure my design was in the hoop. And then for positioning, this is what we went through in webinar 3. For positioning of stitching the large designs, I first centered the design, and then I used the absolute check feature to make sure that the edges of this design were within the block. And then my last step was free motion fill. So this quilt was pretty simple, it was pretty straightforward, but it really shows several techniques and quite well. So then the next quilt I want to talk about is the beads quilt. And when I started this quilt, I wanted it to have a very textured, a very warm and comfortable look. I used one of Amanda's collections for this. And we did have a question come up. I read in between these webinars here, if Amanda's collections were straight stitch or triple stitch, and the majority of them are single stitch. So just give you that information there. For the thread on this quilt, I did use a 50 weight cotton, and I used the 75 quilting needle on this, and warm and white batting, and I did use the securing stitches at the beginning and the end of this design. For this quilt, I just used two quilting techniques, the computerized quilting, where I quilted all of the blocks or the beads, and then I did the free motion quilting along the string of the bead, around the flower in the bead, and then of course the whole negative space, the rest of the quilt was stipple quilted. My process in this particular quilt is I first basted it, and I don't have an image of that, but I did baste it first. And then I did secure everything. So I did the free motion quilting around all of the beads and basically all of the negative space on this particular quilt. So all of that free motion quilting was done before I started quilting my blocks. And then I hooped it, and I did the large centered design, and all I did was just centered this design. So it was really simple just to move from bead to bead and embroider that design. After it was done, I added the free motion stitches just to give that bead a little bit more texture, and I free motioned on the strings. So that was my process for the beads quilt. So now we get into a little bit more details I need to cover, and this is the faded quilt. The finished size of this is a 44 by 44, and with this quilt, I did want to show a lot of dimension, a lot of loft to it. Yet I do want it fairly stable because I want it as a wall hanging. I used one of Amanda's embroidery collections as well. The thread was a 50 weight cotton again, and I did go up to a size 80 because I did have the two layers of batting. I have one layer of warm and white that was on the base, and then I put the wool on top. And the purpose was to get more texture and dimension, more fluff, maybe is the word, on the top of the quilt so you could really see the stitching. And I did use securing stitches at the beginning and the end. Now for this entire quilt, I did use the computerized quilting quilted blocks. And on this one, I want to give a little bit more detail because due to some of the questions that came up. And this is the sample that I was showing to show some negative space. And negative space, of course, in the quilt is, you know, the area where it's just basically a solid fabric. And we have many choices in how we want to fill that negative space. And what I chose to do on this quilt was, if you remember, I did the basting stitches, and I did it in a grid pattern. And then I filled that grid was then actually the size of my block. So that grid made like a fake block for me to use for a placement line. For negative quilting, negative space quilting, like I said, you have a lot of options. And I could have done a design here that is an edge-to-edge design, which an edge-to-edge quilt design is basically a border design, and you're just repeating it over and over. There are some companies that do make specifically for edge-to-edge, which are beautiful designs, and that would have worked very well here too. You know, as I look at different quilts and get inspiration, you do see quilts now where you might see a little cluster of flowers per se embroidered, maybe in a corner, and then you see free motion quilting around it. And you see that a lot of times in the negative space too. And that is just completely possible with this technique also. So you do have a lot of options when you work with the negative space in your quilts. Now on this particular quilt, we did spend a lot of time in the webinars working on this quilt, but my first step here was, of course, to baste it. And then I did mark, and here I did use the chalk marker because it is the darker fabrics. I marked my grid, and then I secured it with the basting stitch on that grid. The size of the design, I did have to reduce the size from the original size that it was so that it would fit in here. In reducing the size of the design, you have a choice to do it either on your machine, or you can go to your software if you are able to download the free ArtLink software, or if you have Designer Plus. So you can resize the design any way that you choose to. So I did have to resize it here to make it fit. After that, I did, on this particular quilt, I didn't have a large enough backing, so I did sew on that strip on the edge of this. I hooped the fabric, and then I stitched these large designs, and the feature that I used for placement was pinpoint placement. And one question that did come out after the third webinar that we had earlier was, how do you place these if you don't have the pinpoint placement feature, if you just have absolute check? And so when I start talking about the color chart quilt, I'm going to show you how you can use absolute check to do this placement, because you absolutely can use that as well. And so here, let's go right into the color chart quilt. And this quilt, this finished size was 60 by 60. And I wanted this just a very lightweight, cuddly quilt that showed some dimension. This is kind of a fun quilt. And with the border, the embroidery design is one that I just digitized in the software because it was just a simple line design, and it worked out really well. The thread, again, 50 weight cotton. I used a 75 quilting needle, and I did use Hobbs silk batting, and I did secure the beginning and the end stitches. So the techniques that I used for quilting this is I did the computerized quilted border, and I did free motion quilting to fill in, on the edges of the border. And then I also did go down, I ended up, the strips here in between the blocks, I ended up at the end adding that same free motion fill there because I just felt it needed a little extra to hold that all together. So to put this particular quilt together, my process was first securing it. And I haven't talked about that yet on this quilt, but I did put this on the long arm frame. You don't need to, you can do this with your walking foot or dual feet. And I secured it by stitching in the ditch here between all the rows. And like I said, I did it on the long arm, but either, whatever method you want to use for securing that. So that was a permanent stitch that stayed in the quilt. My next step then was I did draw the line down the center of this border to use it as a placement line when I was rehooping. And I did make the little marks. I didn't draw lines all the way across, but I did make the little marks for placement of my design. It was 9 3/4 inches, so I did my mark every 9 3/4. I then hooped the I added the extension strip then as well. I hooped the fabric, and I used this line going down the center. There's a little arrow on the hoop here, and at the other end, and I just eyeballed it. I didn't use any templates, but since my embroidery design was a size that I didn't have to have everything perfectly straight in here, it worked just fine to eyeball this and just get that as close as possible. So I hooped it, And then I stitched my large designs here, and I did use the pinpoint placement feature for placement. But again, in just a second here, I'm going to show you how you can use absolute check to do that as well. And then at the end, you can see here, I added my free motion fill stitches. Okay, so I'm going to add a little bit extra to this presentation based on your questions that you had after webinar 3. And so I brought this slide back in to give a little bit further explanation, because you really do have some very good questions. So on this particular quilt, my border, if you remember, was 49 inches. And so if you, I can do 5 hoopings across here. So if you divide this, yes, I know there was a question in there, isn't that 9.8 inches? And yes, it actually is. However, you know, I just went ahead for simplicity's sake, and I did 9 3/4 inches here in the block, because I knew if it was just a little off, I mean, every border, was it exactly 49 inches? Probably not. You know, one might have been 48 7/8 and so forth. So I went ahead and I just marked every 9 7/8. And then when I got to that last hooping on that border, because pinpoint placement, we can stretch that last point. You know, we set the first point and we can stretch that last point. I can just ever so slightly lengthen that design to fit in there perfectly. And so I wasn't real concerned that it was not 9 7/8 a marking all the way, because my 49 inches probably wasn't exact 49 either. If you can quilt that perfectly, I applaud you. I haven't mastered that one yet. But anyway, that was the discrepancy in the measurements that came up in the notes. So then I do want to talk about now, there was a question about how do you use absolute check if you have a 770 and want to do a border or the block like in the faded quilt, or you want to do edge-to-edge quilting. How would you use the absolute check? And for that, I am going to open back up the simulator, and I've just brought in a random border design that is built into the 790. And in this design, this is a design that can be used for edge-to-edge quilting, or it can be used for a border. And you can clearly see up here on the top that this is the starting point, and here at the bottom is the ending point of this design. So with absolute check, so let's just imagine our last design is coming up on the top. With absolute check, I can click right there, and that makes my needle point. And so what I do is I then move my design either up or down, whatever, so my needle is right at the last stitch of that previous design. And this is absolute check. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the bottom, and then you should have marked, remember I marked the borders where my 9 3/4 inches is. So you have a mark there that you then want to line up with this needle. Okay, so here I put this on the end, and now I'm going to perhaps move this where it's going. So now this is where the difference between pinpoint placement and absolute check come in. Because with pinpoint placement, this point up here is set. It is not going to move. And if you notice now with absolute check, as I move, you see the whole design is moving. And so as I'm trying to match this point to the mark I made on my fabric, well, now I'm losing the point up here. And so you have to watch and see what is happening to the design. Are you having to move it downward in order to make it fit, or sideways, you know, whatever? And so with absolute check, you just have to do a little bit more work. So let's say, for instance, you know, I moved it down and I needed to increase the length. So what you can do is you can go into the resizing of it. And right now it is locked. So I'm going to unlock it. So that means I can stretch the design. It's not going to resize it proportionally. And so now I can either make this design, I can shrink it in length, or I can make it grow in length, whatever it needs to be. So I can increase the length, and then I can go back to the top again, line it back up. Oh, I'm still on here, sorry. Line it back up, and then I can check my bottom point and see if now that needle point is where it needs to be. And so it's just a matter of going back and forth and resizing a little bit and maybe rotating in order to get those points to match up. So it absolutely can be done with absolute check. It's just actually easier to do with pinpoint placement, simply because that first point gets set and it cannot move. So I hope that clarified some of those questions that were asked earlier. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the stacked coins pillow. And this pillow is a finished size of 2020. It's actually a really fun little project. I just wanted it to be a soft pillow. In here, I chose 4 of Amanda's. These are all border designs. So these designs actually would work really good for any borders, any places like that that you needed to fill in, because it is just one long continuous line. And you just continue, you just duplicate this pattern as you go along. One feature that I wanted to add to this series of webinars is called Endless Embroidery, and I had to omit it because I didn't have time. But actually, Endless Embroidery is a great feature to use when you need to duplicate the number of designs. And so I'll need to add that to a future webinar, because that's a really good feature as well. So then back to the pillow. So what we did here is I did a 50 weight cotton thread, and I used a quilting needle, a size 75. The batting here, I just, again, wanted it very soft and, you know, just kind of a warm feel. So I used the warm and white batting. And then this is one instance where I did not have a securing stitch, because, I mean, there is a real focus on each one of these designs. And so this is where having the knots or the securing stitches turned off was a real benefit. So I did pull the threads up to the top, and you know, I tied a knot and I buried it at the beginning, and at the end you pull them to the bottom and then tie the knot and bury. So this was a great project for that. On here, I used 2 quilting techniques. I first did the straight line quilting to secure the strips and to, you know, secure the blocks. And then I used the computerized quilting to do the blocks. For the process of it, again, very simple. First, you do baste it. I didn't have an image to show you, but you do baste it first. And then I secured it, I hooped it, and then I did the large designs, or the only designs, and I used pinpoint placement for the placement of these designs. And then finally, we have the Chevron quilt. And this one here, the finished size was 47 by 57. And I wanted this to show a lot of dimension and texture. I wanted, this is going to be a blanket, nothing for the wall, so I wanted it really soft and cuddly. I had a lot of fun with Tula's collection. On this collection, I did take all of the stitches, because the stitches I wanted to use were triple stitch. So I did change all of these to a straight stitch or a single stitch out. And my main reason was the designs, like I said earlier, I wanted them to kind of be a surprise. I just want you to kind of look for them before you see them. I didn't really want them to pop out. And so that's why I chose to change it to a straight stitch. And, you know, it's just really great to have that option to be able to do it. The thread I used, more 50 weight cotton. The I did try a jeans needle on this with the loftier polyester batting, and it just really worked beautiful. And I did do securing stitches at the beginning and the end of each of the Tula designs. So the quilting techniques that I used here is I first did all of the computerized quilting. So I put all of the designs. There was a method a little bit to the madness. I did try to put one design on each row, but some of the designs are large, and so they do overlap into the others. So we have the computerized quilting, and then the ruler work was added afterwards, and I did that on the long arm, but that certainly could have been done on the sewing machine as well. The process for this was, my first step was on all of the designs that I wanted to use, I changed them to a straight stitch. In order to do this, I did have to use the Designer Plus software. That is not a feature that is in the free version of the software that is downloadable from BERNINA.com. There was another question that came up that asked if you have to have software in order to do computerized quilting. And the answer is no, you absolutely don't have to have software. Is it nice to have? Yes, it really is, because it just gives you extra tools to use to make things a little bit easier. But it's not mandatory. You don't have to have software to do this technique. All you really need is an embroidery machine, a machine that will stitch out these continuous line quilting patterns. So the first thing I did here was to change it to a straight stitch. I then basted the layers together, and then I secured it with a basting stitch on the machine, and I did these stitches, these rows, every 6 inches. And then I hooped my fabric. On this one, I did make my backing larger, so I had enough room to do all of my hoopings, and then I stitched the fabrics. Another question, or stitch the designs. Another question that has come up is, did I leave my basting stitches in when I did the embroidery designs? And I did on this particular quilt. The reason being is a continuous line quilting pattern is a very open pattern. And with the basting stitch being, when I used that basting stitch, I'd lengthen my stitch length. And so my basting stitch was about a 7/8 of an inch stitch, very easy to take out. And so with the design not being dense at all, and the basting stitch being a long basting stitch, it was very easy to take out. So I went ahead and just left it in there and embroidered right over the top of it. And that worked very well. So after I did my embroidery designs, the only feature I used for placement was absolute check. I just wanted to make sure it was right where I wanted in between those, the chevron strips of the pattern. So I did use absolute check just to check where the placement of different parts of the design were going to land. Like for instance, you can see in the owl here, I wanted to make sure that that was, where you could see the eyes. And I also wanted to make sure it was centered, the eyes were in the right place. So absolute check was the perfect feature to use there for that placement. And then after my designs were in there, then I did go and did ruler work and just followed the lines of the chevron pattern to do the ruler work. So believe it or not, that wraps it up. So we've gone through the entire process of computerized quilting. There's a lot of tips and extra trips. Oh, now I'm getting tongue-tied. There's a lot of tips and tricks that we can share with you, and we will share with you as we continue to grow this new quilting technique. And actually it's not a new quilting technique. We've been able to do this for years, but we just now need to think about it in terms of, this is another way I can quilt my quilt. I can use it in combination with free motion quilting or ruler work or straight line quilting. And it just adds another option or another tool in our toolbox for machine quilting. So I do thank you for joining me for this series. I do have scheduled, if you follow us on Facebook, I do have another Facebook Live scheduled for June 8th, here in just a couple of weeks. And I had a topic in mind for that, but I am really going to review all of your questions and your comments. So if you have an idea for me, type it in the chat boxes. I do read those. And so I may have to reevaluate a little bit my topic. So we'll be announcing soon what the topic will be, but I hope you can join me on the 8th. So now it's time for some questions and answers, and we have a little bit more time than I had this morning. So I'm going to go back to the original questions, and I'm going to start working down this list for a while. And then after about 5-10 minutes or so of me going through these, I'll go to Emily and see what has come in today. Okay, so more questions. These were general questions that came in after the first and second webinar. And it's what designs that came with the 790 can be used for edge-to-edge quilting on a 2-inch border. Well, actually, the one that I showed in the simulator here just a little bit ago, that is one of the designs that comes in the machine. And so that could absolutely be used. And when I was looking, I believe there was one more that came in the machine that can be used. But for edge-to-edge quilting, you just need a definite start point and an end point. Some design, like on the design we use, the end points are at the top and the bottom. But there are some edge-to-edge quilting designs that the start and the end point is actually in the center, which actually works just fine. It's just rethinking how you're going to hoop that quilt. The next general question was, does the needle up-down work at the end of the design as it does at the start? So this is talking about the thread up command, and no, it does not. And so if you want to tie a knot at the end, the thing to do is just make sure you have your thread cutter shut off. You want to make sure to go into the setup screen and turn that off so it does not cut those ending threads. And then you can you have to cut them manually, and you can make the thread tails then as long as you need for tying that knot. And actually, you don't need it at the end, because the purpose of it at the beginning is so that the thread on the bottom does not get caught up in the bottom stitches. So next question, how much can a design be increased or decreased using software? Oh, I think I might have answered this before. Within the machine, it's recommended not to increase or decrease more than 20%. But if you're in the software, then you're pretty much unlimited as to what you can enlarge and reduce. And that's either one of the softwares, ArtLink or Designer Plus. Can you take a design off the machine to a USB stick, edit it in the software, and then replace it into the machine? And absolutely, and that's a great thing to do, and do all of your editing in the software and then put it back in your machine. So that's a great process to get in the habit of doing, actually. Compatible machines. Does it work with the 730 Artista? Absolutely. You can do this technique with any embroidery machine, any of them. So yes. Now these are some software related questions. Can the embroidery machine quilt patterns that are used in the BERNINA long arm? And no, you cannot. The long arm format is a BQM format, and BERNINA machines take the EXP format, as we talked about earlier. So it's two different formats, and they're not interchangeable. If you do happen to have a long arm, and you do have automation with the Art and Stitch software, in the Art and Stitch software, you can take and convert it into the format that will work with the machines. From webinar 1, must I have BERNINA software to use ArtLink 8 software? And no, you don't. ArtLink is just a standalone software, and it's a free download on BERNINA.com. Oh, these are more questions coming in about a PC or a Mac. And these are software that are compatible with a PC. If you have a Mac, you would need to run this through the programs of Basecamp or Parallels, and then you would be able to use these softwares. And then the next question, the software you refer to, is it BERNINA 8 software with Corel? Yes, that is called our Designer Plus software. For needles, these were the questions that came in. Can you judge when the needle is too large for the thread? And yes, you can. If you remember, this is way back in, I think, webinar 2. That seems so long ago. But, you know, I showed a picture of you holding the thread at a 45-degree angle with the needle on it. And if you just do that little test, if that needle just pretty much falls down that thread, then you know your needle is way too large for that thread and you should go down to a smaller size needle. Or if you need to use that needle due to the fabric or the project that you're doing, then you might want to think about doing a larger thread. What do we think about using titanium needles? I love titanium needles, and you can, the advantage of titanium needles is they last forever, almost forever, I shouldn't say forever, but they last a very long time. And so, yes, you can certainly use titanium needles with this technique. And when using 2 layers of batting, would you do a little bit bigger needle than a 75? And yes, I did go up to an 80 and had very good results. In thread, the questions that came, would you recommend dissolving thread for securing stitches? And no, I would not. The reason being, you want your securing stitches to stay there and you don't want them to be washed out the first time you wash the quilt. So that is something I would not recommend. And then another one was, I was taught to use 60 weight bobbin thread. Is that not a good idea? Well, it all depends upon what you're doing. If 60 weight bobbin thread is what I like to use when I'm doing regular embroidery. So if you've got a dense design and you're doing, you know, just a regular embroidery design that's filled in, then you do want to use a lighter weight bobbin thread because you don't want to add any stiffness to that design. And typically when you're doing a typical or traditional embroidery design, you don't change your bobbin thread, you know, with the colors as you do on the top. So yes, a 60 weight bobbin thread is absolutely appropriate for regular embroidery. However, we're not doing regular embroidery here, we're doing quilting. And so we have to think more in the lines of quilting than embroidery. And so that's why I recommend to use the same thread on top and in bottom in color, content, and weight. And just think, like I said, think in terms of quilting a project instead of embroidering it. Tension, questions on that? Would the tension be adjusted the same in an Aurora 440 or a 640 or an 830 as you suggested with the 880? Well, the machines you happen to suggest here, the 440, 640, and 830, those are all 3 different bobbin or hook system machines. So each of them has a different way of adjusting the bobbin tension. The 440 was a CB hook machine, and so for that, you've got a couple options there. The finger in that bobbin case actually had a hole in it, so you could thread the thread through there and increase your tension if you needed to. There was also a black latch bobbin case that you could use that, you know, the screw on that you could certainly tighten and loosen according to your thread. On the 640, that was a rotary hook machine, and so the rotary hook machines came with, or there was a secondary bobbin case with the pigtail on it. And so you would put your thread through that pigtail, and therefore that would increase the bobbin tension. So that's how you would increase that. And then on the 830 and the 880, since the bobbin case is in the machine, there's no external bobbin case that comes out, then you would adjust that right there in the machine. So that was a very good question. How do you adjust tension so you don't have eyelashes in the stitching on the back side of the quilting? And for this one, it'd be really a lot easier if I could see what you're working with. it's kind of hard to diagnose. Typically, if you have loose stitches on the bottom side of your quilt, that means the first thing I would check is my tension, and I would tighten my top tension, because if you're getting loops on the bottom, that tells me too much thread is going, passing through and causing a loop. That would be my first thing to check. I'd also check the lower tension, see where that's at. Try, don't remember if you said what machine you're using, but try the different bobbin cases and see if that helps. From there, I would check needle, see if you have a burr on your needle, see if you have a burr on your needle plate somewhere internally with the hook system. That would be catching on that thread as it's stitching. So that one's hard to diagnose without seeing, but those are the things I would check. And then basting, I think this is my last slide, Emily, so we'll go to your questions next. Basting on the Chevron quilt. Oh, I answered this one. Did you put the straight line over the embroidered, or did you stop it? And oh no, I didn't. This is about, I think this one's talking about the ruler work. And on the, if it's talking about the ruler work, I did not do the ruler work through the embroidery design. I stopped it on the edges of the design. But my basting stitch, I left it in and stitched right over it and then pulled it out. And then last question, if you machine based a quilt before embroidering, would you take the, would you take out the basting stitches once you hooped it and before you start embroidering? And no, I leave them in there and I stitch right over, because that design is an open design and it's very easy to take those out. So those are the questions that I have so far from the first two webinars. Emily, you wanna let me know what come in this time?
Everybody, welcome back.
Yes.
Okay, let's start at the top here. Okay, what do you do if you have something you don't want to hoop? Soft and stable for like a tote bag and you want to quilt it.
And you don't want to hoop it?
Right.
Then you're looking at other quilting techniques, so then, if you don't want to hoop it, then you can't embroider it. To be able to embroider, it has to be hooped. So you're looking at either doing free motion quilting, a straight line quilting, or ruler work, actually, you could use too.
Can the gift rebate be used on an L890 serger?
Of course it can. It's a
I
machine.
think somebody's gonna go get themselves a new 890. Yay.
They're
Okay.
fabulous too, yeah.
Can you go over again which machines have pinpoint placement?
Pinpoint placement is on an 880, a 790, a 590, and the 500 and the 700.
Okay. If you have applique on your quilt, how do you stitch around it, or what is the best method for quilting around your applique?
I probably wouldn't recommend to do the computerized quilting at that point. I would probably do a free motion if it was mine, or a straight line quilting, maybe just around the block.
Okay.
And yeah, to see it would give me a better way to answer that. But I think you're walking away from the computerized quilting in that instance, which is fine, yeah.
What would the advantages of using silk batting be?
The softness of it. It's a very soft batting, and it gives a nice fluff, I guess, so you can see your stitches. It's nice dimension.
What brands of 50-weight cotton thread do you like to use for your quilting?
There's that brand question again. The two that I use most often, but not exclusively, I use Mettler and I use Aurifil, are the two that, those are the ones actually I used in my projects here, but I use others as well.
Okay. We had quite a few questions about your upcoming webinar on June 8th. Is that going to be on the BERNINA of America Facebook page?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's going to be a Facebook Live. It's
Okay.
not a webinar, so it's Facebook Live, and so it's just a little different format than this. And yeah, just watch the BERNINA of America Facebook page, and Elise will be announcing that here in probably in about 2 weeks. Yeah.
Awesome. Regarding titanium needles, how long is the life of a titanium needle, and when should you expect to change it if you're doing this type of quilting method on your machine?
Well, you know, this method of continuous line quilting, it doesn't take near the number of stitches as an embroidery design would. And because typically, you know, one design might have 1,000 stitches in the continuous line quilting pattern, depending upon the size and so forth. When you go to embroidery designs, you know, there are a lot more stitches to that. And so in continuous line quilting, a titanium needle can last a long time. To give you a number of stitches it would last, I don't have in my head. It's just the same rules of thumb, you know, when you start seeing either breakage of threads, or you can hear it, you can kind of hear that thunking sound, you know, that's your indicator you do need to change it. But it's hard to say number of quilts, it's hard to say number of stitches because there's so many variables, but they do last considerably longer than the standard needle.
Sure. When quilting a larger quilt, do you prefer to roll your quilt and then unroll it as you do your different sections? What is your preferred method to keep things nice and tidy?
Yeah, this all gets back to that securing stitch and why it's important to do that, to keep all that together, because I'm twisting and turning my quilt all the time. You know, remember, I keep my outer hoop on my module the whole time, and my inner hoop is the only thing that comes off. So I'm not constantly taking this quilt off and on my machine. So, but what I am doing is when I release that hoop, I'm twisting my quilt around, and I am working so that I don't have a lot of extra quilt in the arm of the machine. If I do, then yes, I roll it up to keep it out of the way, but I really work to rotate the quilt around to the spot that I need to embroider. And because it's simple in the machine to rotate the design. So I, depending upon where I'm quilting, I make the design accommodate where I need to quilt in terms of rotating. Yeah.
The next question, I believe, is about pinpoint placement. When using a rotating design, do you have to redo the pinpoints as well as the rotation? I believe in between each embroidery section, or will it?
Yeah. Yes. With pinpoint placement, same with absolute check and centering the design. You have to do that for every pattern, every block. You have to reset that each time, because it just depends upon where you put the fabric in your hoop. You're not going to always put it in the same exact place in your hoop. So yes, you would be redoing that each time.
Okay. And needle question, what is the difference between titanium and chrome needles?
Chrome is another needle I honestly have not had a lot of experience with. But what I have read up on it, they have a lot of the same features as the titanium. So you're just basically looking at two different brands of needles. And there you just have to test and see what your preference is between the two.
Okay. And let's see here. The next question. Let's see. What are your preferences when quilting? Do you do BSR, free motion? And if you do BSR, do you use mode 1 or mode 2?
I love all the quilting techniques, so that's a hard one. I can't pinpoint one that I like better than the other. And the one I choose for, or one or two or three that I choose for a project, is dependent upon the project. And so I enjoy doing them all. In terms of the modes for BSR 1 and 2, it also depends upon my project. And if I want it to continue to be stitching and like securing those stitches when I'm not moving my fabric, or do I want it to stop stitching when I am not moving my fabric? And I switch back and forth depending upon.
Okay.
And it also depends too, if I can add, I don't want to get too lengthy, but it also depends upon how tight or micro my stitches are too. And, you know, if I'm doing tiny fill stitches, like in, you know, the beads quilt along the string for the beads, you know, I want it to be continuous quilting, so I could get that micro without there being like a lag in the stitch. So it again depends upon what I'm doing.
Okay. We have a question about toolbox, if you're okay with answering a question about toolbox.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you edit in toolbox to change from a triple stitch to a single stitch?
That is a very good question, and you're really taxing my memory right now. And I don't believe it is a feature in that software, and I'd rather err on the side of being safe, because that is an editing feature. You have to be able to edit designs to do that. So I would say no, but I will, on the comment sheet, I'll look up your email address and answer you on that to give you a definite answer.
Let's see. Totally random. Sherry wanted to know about the artwork that's behind me. I'm not currently in my office. I'm in my boss's office, but I will find that out for you and email you. How about that? I needed a quiet space today. So, okay, let's pick a couple more questions and then we're going to end the session for today. Let's see. Back to a little basic quilting. It doesn't have to do embroidery, but when you stitch in the ditch, what stitch length do you use?
That kind of varies too. It kind of varies on what you're doing. I like to have mine around 3 is typical, but not always that way.
Personal preference, test it out, see what you like, see what kind of thread you're using, if you wanted to show more, or if you don't want it to show. So that's the great thing about quilting. It's your project. It's up to you, 100%.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's see. We got a lot of thank yous. We also want to thank you for being here with us this week. We've had a lot of fun. Okay, let's see. Does an 830 have absolute check?
Yes. Oh, yes, it does. Yes.
Okay. When doing edge-to-edge quilting, is there an easy way to match up your starting and ending points? That's a quick question.
Well, you can use, you can use either absolute check or even better, pinpoint placement. Yes.
Okay. And that is all that